Hi, my name is Rob Schenk, and I'm with the Friends of Charleston National Park, and we're here with Rick Hatcher, who is the author of Thunder in the Harbor, a new history on Fort Sumter in the Civil War. Rick, what led you to want to write Thunder in the Harbor?
Well, when I came to Fort Sumter as the historian in 1992, the only publication available on the history of Fort Sumter was the National Park Service Fort Sumter Handbook, which gives a very nice overview, but it lacked obviously quite a bit of depth and detail regarding the full history of the fort. So in my career there and retiring in 2015, that's why I decided to embark and write this book, giving a complete history of the fort.
Rick, tell us a little bit about the origins of Fort Sumter. When was it built and what was it designed to do?
Okay, the result of Fort Sumter is like a whole series of additional coastal forts that our nation has that came out as a result of the War of 1812. And we know that today is the third coastal defense system. So not just Fort Sumter, but Fort Morgan and Fort Gaines down in Mobile, Alabama, Fort Jefferson, Dry Tortugas, even Fort Point under the Golden Gate Bridge today are all as a result of the War of 1812, and Fort Sumter was a part of that new coastal defense system. Now, the forts predating the War of 1812, by the time we get past that war, are considered to be inadequate with the number of guns, size, and that position to provide proper defense for ports, harbors, and coastal areas of the nation. So Charleston already had three forts. You can look at Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, and Castle Pinckney, but once again, those are considered inadequate because of the advances being made in artillery with larger guns, and then of course larger warships to carry those guns. So a new fort's going to be needed to help protect this vital port of Charleston against a potential invasion from the sea. And the fort was ideally to end up looking like this. Of course, the fort was never completed. It was about 90% complete when South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th of 1860. And after that point, construction would stop, and the fort would never be completed.
Rick, it's the morning of April 12th, 1861. Give us a sense of what the federal command had to oppose all those Confederate gun positions around the fort.
Well, the Federals had been working on preparing the defenses of Fort Sumter from the time they arrived there on the night of December 26, 1860, all the way up until the morning of April 12, 1861. So they had ended up mounting a total of 65 guns in the fort. And the Confederates only had 43 guns directed upon them from north, south, east, and west. But Anderson, Major Robert Anderson, the command just did not have enough soldiers to man all those cannons. So, and over the course of time, if we go from the end of December of 1860 to April of 1861, the Federals would have been up on the ramparts of Fort Sumter and would see the Confederates bringing ordnance and fortification building materials out to Cummings Point on Morris Island, seeing Fort Johnson be brought online, upgrading the guns and material at Fort Moultrie and earthen defenses along Sullivan's Island, etc. So they could just gradually see the Southerners building and preparing more and more defenses, where once again they're going to can be fired on from the 4 points of the compass: north, south, east, and west. And then finally, when the Confederates do open fire at 4:30 on the morning on April 12, 1861, the opening shot is from a 10-inch Seacoast mortar that shell explodes directly over the fort. And what happens after that is about a 10 to 15 minute mortar bombardment of the fort, and then the Confederate cannons would join in after that. Also of note is there's a 12-pounder Blakely rifled cannon on Cummings Point, and that will fire some rounds at the fort as well. So for the first time in the war, a rifled artillery gun will be used in the bombardment of Fort Sumter. First time a rifled artillery piece used in the war.
And Rick, when the Confederates finally take possession of the fort on April 14th, what's the state of Fort Sumter after that terrible bombardment?
Well, an estimated 3,000 artillery rounds have been fired by the Confederates over the course of the 34-hour bombardment. At least 600 hit the exterior walls of the fort. However, those walls are 7 feet thick. They have an inner and outer brick layer, and it has rammed concrete in the center. And none of those Confederate rounds go through that 7-foot thick walls. But it's the hot shot fired from the mortars and guns and the other rounds that will come up over the walls of the fort from the cannons, and with exploding shell and those hot shot land inside the buildings of the fort, both barracks buildings and officers' quarters, and will essentially completely destroy those by fire. And this, shortly after the Confederates move into the fort, here you can see one of the 3 enlisted men's barracks that is completely gutted by fire, and it's just a brick shell now. And of course, off and on across here, you can see the impact of some of the Confederate rounds on the interior parapet areas of the fort. So it gives you an example of some of the damage done.
Rick, so what about the federal garrison? Did they take casualties during the bombardment?
There were a few soldiers slightly injured by brick fragments, things like that. No one was killed during the actual combat on either side. There were a few Confederates also injured. The only known death was a Confederate lieutenant's horse on Sullivan's Island that was hit by one of the Union rounds. That's the only known death in the entire bombardment. However, there's, of course, April 14th, 1861, when Anderson is granted permission to fire a 100-gun salute, blank salute, in honor of the nation and the flag before it's lowered, when they surrendered the fort. The 47th round, while it's being loaded, the cannon discharges prematurely, kills Private Daniel Howe, so he will be the first soldier to lose his life in the war. And then a Private Edward Galway will be mortally wounded and die a few days later. So the first 2 deaths in the war is not caused directly by combat. It's firing that honorable salute at the end of the bombardment and the surrender of the fort. And because of that tragedy, Anderson cuts that firing salute down to 50 guns. And Private Howe is buried in the parade ground of Fort Sumter. And we still don't know where his remains are to this day.
Rick, your book doesn't just cover April 1861 history of Fort Sumter, but the entire Civil War history of the fort. What other important events did Sumter witness and take part in?
Well, most importantly, Fort Sumter is the focal point of the longest siege in American history, from July 10th, 1863 until February 18th, 1865. 587-day siege operation by the United States Army and Navy. Of course, in relation to that, the most famous events is the U.S. forces moving on to Morris Island, July 10th, 1863. Shortly after that, we have the assault on Battery Wagner, led by the 54th Massachusetts, which was made famous, of course, in the movie Glory. But this is, really starts into the siege operations. The United States Army forces move large, heavy siege guns onto the island, establish breaching batteries. And in August of 1863, they start the first major bombardment of Fort Sumter. It's August 17th, 1863. In the first 7 days of that bombardment, United States artillery are going to fire over 550,000 pounds of artillery projectiles at Fort Sumter. Now keep in mind, Fort Sumter is a 2.5-acre target. And also, this is the United States Navy is bombarding the fort as well. Now, previous to that, the United States Navy had tried their turn at trying to take Fort Sumter with what we know as the Ironclad attack. This occurs on April 7th, 1863, and this makes United States military history, especially for the United States Navy, because for the first time, 9 U.S. Navy Ironclad warships are going to go into battle. This battle will last 2.5 hours. Over the course of that bombardment and combat between the Confederate defenses in Fort Sumter, on Morris Island, and on Sullivan's Island, over 90 tons of artillery projectiles are going to be exchanged between both sides. Fort Sumter will receive very limited damage, but it does show the power of the United States Navy with their ironclad vessels now. But even though they are defeated with the loss of the USS Keokuk in that fight, the United States Army and Navy will then gather back at Port Royal, and they will then determine upon their joint operation to take Fort Sumter. And by taking Fort Sumter and driving the Confederate forces off Morris Island, they believe then the United States Navy and Army can reduce Fort Sumter, and then the Navy can fight its way in and take Charleston, which once again will lead to the longest siege in American history, with the siege of Charleston of 1863, 1865. Say, after the ironclad attack, we have the United States Army and Navy moving on to Morris Island, establishing their siege batteries. They will have 3 major bombardments of Fort Sumter. They will also have 7 minor bombardments of Fort Sumter, and 10 periods of what they call desultory fire, resulting when Fort Sumter is finally evacuated on the night of February 17th, 1865. There have been 7 million pounds of artillery projectiles fired at Fort Sumter, well over 46,000 rounds of ammunition, making Fort Sumter the most heavily bombarded 2.5 acres on this continent of warfare.
Rick, that's amazing. Millions and millions of pounds of ordnance have hit Fort Sumter over this entire period. I mean, what was the state of the fort towards the end of the war?
Well, this photograph taken in 1865, you can see this long section here is the gorge wall of the fort today, and this is a general area where visitors come into the fort, this left flank wall. But so the Confederates did what they could on the exterior wall to kind of stabilize things, but on the interior, they converted many of the casemates and what was surviving inside from the bombardments into like giant bomb-proof and storage facilities. So the Confederates were able to withhold. Now, keep into account above the foundation's about 5 feet above the surface of the water, and the original walls rose to a height of over 48 feet above that foundation. So, and you can see how literally the parapet of the fort and most of the top tier, the third tier, where the gun emplacements and things have been destroyed, and it's just been beaten into a sloping mass of ruin, because this is the area closest to Morris Island. And as the Federals got full control of the island and built batteries up on Cummings Point, it was almost impossible to miss, to fire upon the fort at will. And of course, the Confederates are completely outgunned. They cannot go up against the power of the artillery of the combined United States Army and Navy. And so the Confederates will remove most of their guns from the fort over the course of the siege operation, and Fort Sumter will be converted to artillery installation holding about 90 guns and mortars to an infantry post with sometimes 150 to 250 or so Confederate infantry in there. But the Confederates would eventually maintain about 10 cannons in the fort, so it would go to also having at least 1 company of Confederate artillery in it. But essentially now Fort Sumter is an infantry outpost at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. It is no longer an artillery defensive position.
I mean, Rick, why did the Confederates still occupy the fort even in this devastated state?
Well, a couple of things are happening here. For the morale factor in the eyes of the Confederacy, this is where they began their war for independence and nationhood. The bombardment of Fort Sumter is where they fired their shots to be heard around the world in 1861 for their bid for nationhood and independence. So it has a great symbolic meaning to the Confederates. Also, blockade runners are still making their way in and out of Charleston Harbor. So it's very important for the Confederates to hold on to that to help possibly support any of those blockade runners coming in and out. And it's a vital signal post. Members of the Confederate Signal Corps are in the fort, and from their positions they can watch the signaling going on with the United States Navy ships, the United States Army on Morris Island, and some of the exchanges going on because the Confederates have gotten the United States Army and Navy signal code. And the United States Army and Navy didn't change that throughout the siege. So the Confederate Signal Corps could watch the signaling going back and forth and send the messages in to Beauregard's headquarters, as an example, in Charleston, because there was also a telegraph operator out at the fort and a telegraph line leading over to James Island and then on into Charleston, where they could telegraph right into Charleston what they were determining or interpreting from those signals from the United States Signal Corps, Army and Navy.
And what was it like living in a fort that's so devastated like this?
Well, most of the time, the Confederates would stay in their bomb proofs during the day because, of course, at that time, most artillery fire is direct fire, meaning you have to see the target before you can hit it. So it was in the evening when most of the activity took place in the fort with the Confederate Corps of Engineers and having hired several hundred enslaved laborers from local plantations and within the state to come out and make repairs to damages. And this is when the Confederates were generally, the garrison would man the parapet or the rubble of the top of the fort. And one of their systems was set up is 1/3 of the garrison would be up on the top parapet of the fort during the night, 1/3 down on the parade ground, and the other third would be in the barracks or in the bomb proofs. So the next day, the units that were up on the top of the fort would transfer down to the parade ground. The men on the parade ground would go up onto the top, and the men out of the barracks would come out and fill in. And so they would do this 1/3 rotation of the garrison each night to give the men some rest.
And Rick, it's sort of amazing that given the bombardment, the devastation, the heavy artillery has been largely eliminated, yet the fort is never taken militarily during the war.
There is an amphibious assault by 400 sailors and Marines on the night of, well, actually 1 a.m. in the morning on September the 9th. However, the Confederates know they're coming, they're waiting for them, and when the first two waves of boats in this amphibious assault land, the Confederates open up with musket fire, hand grenades, and even other members of the garrison are taking chunks of brick rubble and throwing them down on the Federal forces. The fight only lasts 20 minutes. Over 100 sailors and Marines are killed, captured, or wounded or injured. Not a single member of the Confederate garrison was injured, killed, wounded, no casualties whatsoever. So there was at least one attempt made, and that's about 1 o'clock in the morning on September the 9th, 1863. Over the course of this bombardment, with approximately 7 billion pounds of artillery projectiles, the Confederates suffer 339 casualties. That's military and civilian, including some of those enslaved laborers. But to suffer only 339 overall casualties for 7 billion pounds of projectiles was, you could say, was not an effective return on their investment of artillery rounds. Destroying Fort Sumter as an effective artillery installation, yes, but driving the Confederates out and forcing them to give it up, no.
I mean, Rick, we're looking at this photo here of the devastation at Sumter. We think about its military role in the Civil War. Was the fort effective? Was it something that the United States wanted to build more of after the Civil War?
No, with the great advances made in rifle artillery, it was determined that fixed installations, brick and stone forts, are considered obsolete. Of course, this was demonstrated before this happened at Fort Sumter with the bombardment of Fort Pulaski, April 10th and 11th, 1862, with those rifle breaching batteries below the fort that will breach the walls of the 7-foot thick walls of Pulaski in 30 hours, and Fort Pulaski surrenders. So essentially, from April of 1862, stone and brick forts around the world are now obsolete. Rifle artillery can penetrate those stone and brick walls. And it's very aptly demonstrated here again with Fort Sumter, but Fort Sumter just didn't surrender.
So Rick, Fort Sumter at the end of the Civil War has one more great moment. Describe what that moment was.
Okay, it's April 14th, 1865. 4 years to the day from April 14th, 1861, when Fort Sumter was surrendered, the U.S. flag lowered, and of course Anderson and his garrison leave the fort. Once again, on that day, April 14th, 1865, now Brevet Major General Robert Anderson returns, and there's about 3,000 soldiers, sailors, Marines, dignitaries, and civilians there, and they will gather, and this is showing them starting to gather up, and Anderson will re-raise the same United States flag he had lowered at the fort April 14th, 1861, and of course do it on April 14th, 1865. So that was the last major Civil War event in Fort Sumter's history, with the gathering of those folks and that well-known incident then taking place. Of course, that night at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., President Lincoln will be assassinated. So in some ways, this has been lost to history because of the president's assassination. But this is the last major historic event in the history of Fort Sumter during the war.
So Rick, after the Civil War concludes, Fort Sumter's still there. What sort of functions did Fort Sumter have after the war?
Well, first of all, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has to come in, and they're going to remove the rubble and debris and look at the status and condition of the fort. They will obviously determine not to rebuild the fort to its full height of 3 tiers. They're going to stabilize the fort into essentially a 1-tier and 2nd-tier fortification. It's going to generally not have a garrison, but what they call a fort keeper at the fort. That will be generally an ordnance or artillery sergeant who's just there for maintenance and security of the site. But also, they're going to build a navigational lighthouse there, and so there's going to be someone also there to operate that navigational light for the harbor. So its primary purpose, its service will be for navigational purposes with that navigational light. Of course, with the Spanish-American War, they're going to build Battery ICQG in the middle of the fort, occupies about 1/3 of the interior of the fort, that massive concrete structure we see in there today. It would have mounted 2 12-inch large breech-loading rifle cannon. Barrels weigh about 53 tons apiece, and firing artillery rounds that have a range of about 10 miles. Of course, it'll never see any combat. Of course, there are threats to the coastline as we get into World War II. On 2 occasions, German U-boats will mine the entrance to Charleston Harbor, about 3 miles or so out in front of Fort Sumter. So there is a need for coastal defenses still. The large guns will be taken out and cut up for scrap for the war effort. There will be 4 90mm anti-aircraft guns placed in the fort to help guard the submarine netting that's ways out in front of the fort. And there'll be a couple of 30 caliber machine guns in there. So we'll be garrisoned through World War II. But with the end of World War II, and of course the advances made with fleets with aircraft carriers, high altitude, long range bombers, fixed installations are totally obsolete. And so those forts will be closed down gradually by the War Department, and some of them will be transferred over to the National Park Service and to other government entities. And of course, Fort Sumter is one of those. The fort is shut down in 1947, transferred to the National Park Service in 1948, and is designated Fort Sumter National Monument. And in 2019, it is redesignated Fort Sumter Fort Moultrie National Historical Park.
Well, I want to thank Rick Hatcher for a great interview talking about the history of Fort Sumter. And I would just say to any Civil War buff or anyone with interest in our American history, Thunder in the Harbor is a fantastic book to read and really covers that entire rich history of Fort Sumter that sits out in Charleston Harbor even today. So thank you, Rick.
Thank you. Great.